The station, called Conclave Oru, floated between three star systems like a metal city that nobody owned. It belonged to everyone and to no one, which meant every species in the Galactic Compact had agreed, at least on paper, to behave themselves inside it. The halls were wide enough to fit a cargo ship sideways, and the air smelled like 40 different worlds mixed together. Something sweet from the Velkai vents, something sharp from the draft quarters, and something burnt from whatever the kitchen staff had done to the evening meal again. Sergeant Mara Voss walked through those halls with a cup of coffee in one hand and a data slate in the other, and she did not look like much. She was average height for a human woman, which meant she came up to the chest of most species she passed in the corridor. The Drath alone stood nearly a full meter above her, broad-shouldered, armor-plated across the back and collar, moving through the station like they expected. Everything to get out of their way, which most things did. Mara had short dark hair, a calm face, and the kind of eyes that did not give away what she was thinking. Her fellow soldiers said she had the same expression whether she was reading a mission report or watching someone throw a punch at her, which they meant as a compliment. She was part of Earth's diplomatic escort, 6 soldiers, attached to Ambassador Risa Cole's delegation, here for the compact treaty negotiations that had been dragging on for 11 weeks and showed no sign of finishing. The negotiations were about territory, specifically about 3 mineral-rich systems near human space that 4 other species also wanted access to, and the talks had been tense, careful, and exhausting, full of long silences and careful words and the particular kind of politeness that meant everyone in the room was furious. The evening reception was Ambassador Cole's idea, a chance to loosen things up, share food. Share drink? Let the diplomats breathe without a negotiating table in front of them. It was held in the Compact's central gathering hall, a room with a curved ceiling and soft amber lighting, and tables arranged in a wide circle, so that no delegation sat at a head. Every species equal, every seat the same distance from the center. Mara stood near the wall with her coffee, and watched the room the way soldiers watch rooms, not dramatically, not with her hand near a weapon, but with the quiet attention of someone who is always counting exits. She noticed Vekara before Vekara noticed her. The Drath warlord caste warrior was not hard to notice. She was the largest individual in the room, nearly 7 feet tall, with 4 arms, the upper 2 heavy and long, the lower 2 shorter and faster, all 4 ending in broad hands that could close around a human skull without much effort. Mara had read the briefing files and knew that Drath upper caste warriors were considered by most of the Compact to be the finest close combat species in known space, a title they had held for over 1,000 years and defended with enthusiasm. Vekara wore no formal diplomatic clothing. She wore her rank armor, dark and ridged, with the silver markings of a warlord caste veteran across both upper shoulders. Her record, according to the same briefing file, included 38 formal duels across 12 species, all decided in her favor. She was standing with Ambassador Thel Oris and 3 other Drath officials, and they were talking quietly, and Vekara was looking across the room with a slow, measuring gaze that moved from table to table like someone selecting fruit at a market. When that gaze landed on Mara, it stopped. Mara took a sip of her coffee. Vekara said something to Oris, and Oris smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that meant something had just been decided. Then Vekara walked across the room. The conversations nearby fell quiet as she passed. She moved through the crowd without hurrying and without adjusting her path, and everyone else adjusted theirs. She stopped in front of Mara, and looked down at her with the particular expression of someone examining something they do not consider a serious object. "You are the human soldier," Vekara said. Her voice was deep and carried even at low volume, and her translator collar turned the Drath syllables into flat, clear words. "One of them," Mara said. "I am Vekara, warlord caste, third bloodline of the Drath Reach, the warrior said, and the words had the rhythm of something formally announced. Mara Voss, Mara said. Sergeant, Earth Diplomatic Escort. Several of the nearby delegations had gone very still. The Velkai scholar Suri, a small gray-skinned creature standing 2 tables away, had stopped mid-sentence and was watching with very wide eyes. Vekara reached into the upper chest of her armor and produced a flat disc of dark metal. She held it forward between 2 fingers and let it fall to the floor between them. It rang once against the metal ground and sat there, and the room got even quieter. Every species in the compact knew what that disc meant. It was a formal duel token, and under compact law, if the party it was offered to refused it, the refusing party surrendered all standing claims in any current negotiation. It was an old tradition, brutal in its simplicity, designed by species who had not fully trusted words yet. Ambassador Cole appeared at Mara's shoulder from somewhere to the left. She was a tall woman with silver hair and a face that had handled decades of hard diplomatic situations, and even she looked briefly pale. Sergeant Voss, Cole said quietly, very carefully. You do not have to. She does, Vekara said simply. Or your delegation loses the mineral systems by morning. That is compact law, Ambassador, and you know it as well as I do. The room was silent now, not the polite quiet of diplomacy, but the hard silence of a crowd that has just seen something unexpected happen and is holding its breath. Mara looked down at the disc on the floor. She looked up at Vekara. She set her coffee cup on the nearest table. Then she bent down, picked up the disc, and held it in her palm for a moment before closing her fingers around it. Accepted, she said. The alien delegations erupted, not in alarm, but in the loud, overlapping noise of 24 species all reacting at once. Mara heard laughter from the Drath corner, the high clicking sound that the Velkai made when surprised, and the low rumble of something large in the back of the room shifting its weight. Vekara tilted her head, and for one moment something moved across her expression. Not respect exactly, but a small recalibration, the way a warrior looks when something she expected to flinch does not flinch. The arena, tomorrow at the 8th station hour, Vekara said. I will make it quick. You have my word on that, soldier. Mara nodded once. I'd tell you the same, she said, in the same flat, calm voice she used for everything, but I haven't decided yet. Vekara looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked back to her delegation. The room started breathing again. Cole leaned close to Mara and said in a low, urgent voice, Please tell me you have a plan. Mara picked up her coffee from the table where she had left it, found it was still warm, and took a sip. Yeah, she said. What is it? The news moved through Conclave Oru the way fire moves through dry grass. Fast, hungry, and impossible to stop once it started. By the time Mara got back to the human quarters that night, the station's internal message boards had already posted 3 separate threads about the duel. The betting terminals in the lower corridor had opened odds, and a Drath junior officer had apparently started taking informal wagers in the loading bay using real credit chips. The odds were 340 to 1 in Vekara's favor. Mara read the number on her data slate, set the slate face down on her bunk, and went to sleep. The other soldiers in the escort watched her do this. There were 5 of them, and they sat in the common room of the human quarters, in various states of quiet. Corporal Jan Thresh was cleaning his boots. Specialist Dahlia Park was reviewing a mission report she had already read twice. Private Luke Omar was leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed. The 2 others, Reyna and Dost, were playing a card game neither of them appeared to be concentrating on. None of them looked worried. Not in the way you would expect. Not the tight-jawed, stiff-backed kind of not worried that is really very worried, wearing a calm face. Just genuinely, practically unbothered. The way people look when they are waiting for a delayed transport, rather than waiting for their colleague to fight a 7-foot killing machine in the morning. Ambassador Cole, who was not a soldier and had not spent her career learning to wear a calm face over fear, could not sleep. She sat at the small desk in her private room and read everything she could find about Drath duel tradition, and the more she read, the worse she felt. The Drath had been dueling formally for 4,000 years, their warlord caste trained in combat from the age of 3, which for a Drath was old enough to hold a weapon, and they trained every day without exception until they died or retired, whichever came first. The physical advantages were staggering on paper. 4 functional combat limbs, natural bone plating across the vital areas of the body, a pain tolerance that had evolved specifically for combat conditions, and reflexes that measured faster than any unaugmented human by a significant margin. Vekara herself had not lost a duel in 22 years. Cole closed the file at 2 in the morning, sat in the dark, and thought about what she was going to say to Earth's Council if the sergeant died on a diplomatic station during a treaty negotiation. Across the station, in a long observation corridor with wide windows looking out over open space, the Velkai scholar Suri was still awake and had been since the reception. He was a small creature, barely 5 feet, covered in smooth gray skin that shifted to pale silver when he was anxious, and he had been very silver for several hours now. Suri studied sentient species for a living. It was his life's work, the thing he cared about more than anything else, and humanity was his current subject, which was why he had been assigned to observe this diplomatic session. Humans were new to the compact, young in the galactic sense, and most species paid them only passing attention. After tonight, Suri was revising his assumptions. He pulled out his research journal, a physical one, because he thought better with something in his hands, and started writing. He wrote about the moment the duel token hit the floor and what he had expected to happen next. The human would hesitate, look to her superior, show some sign of the biological self-preservation instinct that every species in the compact demonstrated when faced with a physically superior opponent. It was not cowardice, it was simply the rational response of a creature that understood its own limitations. What had happened instead was that the human had picked up the disc. Bravado. Suri had seen bravado. He knew what it looked like. The wide stance and the raised chin and the performance of courage for an audience. This was not that. The human had picked up the disc the way someone picks up a dropped pen, matter-of-factly, and then she had spoken in a voice that was lower and calmer than it had been a moment before, not higher and louder the way voices went when emotion spiked. He wrote that down and underlined it. In the morning he decided he needed to speak to her directly. He found her in the station's small, human-designated eating area at the 6th hour, which was 2 hours before the duel. She was sitting alone with a cup of coffee and a plate of food she was eating at a pace that suggested appetite rather than nerves. Suri introduced himself carefully and asked if he could sit. She gestured to the seat across from her. "I am studying your species," he said, because he believed in being direct, "and I would like to ask you something personal, if you will allow it." "Go ahead," she said. "Are you afraid?" She looked at him, not through him, not past him, directly at him, which was something humans did that still surprised Suri, because most species looked slightly to the side when thinking. She was quiet for a few seconds, actually considering the question. "Yes," she said, "Vekara is very good, and she is much bigger than me, and she has 4 arms, which is 2 more than I have. I would be an idiot not to be afraid." "Then why did you accept?" Suri asked. "Because not accepting was worse," she said simply. Suri wrote that down. He walked back through the station after that, thinking hard, and he passed through the corridor outside the human quarters. The door was open, and he could see 4 of the other soldiers inside, and none of them were preparing the way soldiers from every other species prepared before a colleague faced a serious duel. Among the Drath, there would be ceremony. Among the Velkai, there would be communal ritual. Among the Karath, there would be prayer. The human soldiers were just existing. One was asleep, one was reading, Two were talking about something that made them both laugh quietly. Suri stopped walking. He stood outside the open door for a moment and looked at them. One of them, the corporal who had been cleaning his boots the night before, noticed Suri standing there and looked over. "Can I help you?" the corporal said, not unkindly. "I was observing," Suri said. "I apologize. I only wanted to ask, are you not concerned for your colleague?" The corporal considered him for a moment with the same direct, steady look the sergeant had used. "Sergeant Voss?" he said. "Yes." The corporal shrugged in that particular way humans shrugged, the small lift and drop of the shoulders that carried an entire sentence's worth of meaning. "Fine," he said. "The odds are 340 to 1, Suri said. "Yeah," the corporal said, and went back to his boots. Suri stood there another moment, then said, more quietly, "Why are none of you watching the sergeant to see if she is frightened?" The corporal looked up again. "We're not watching Voss," he said, and for the first time, something crossed his expression that Suri could not immediately name. It was not amusement, not quite. It was closer to the look of someone who already knows the answer to a question someone else hasn't figured out yet. He nodded his head, not toward the human quarters, not toward the arena, toward the draft section of the station, far down the corridor. "Wrong person to watch," he said. Suri looked down the corridor. He looked back at the corporal. He opened his journal and wrote for a long time. The dueling arena on Conclave Oru was not built for spectacle, but it had become one anyway. A wide, flat, circular floor of gray composite material, walls that curved up and back into tiered observation seating, bright white lighting that left no shadows anywhere on the floor, and enough space that two large combatants could move without obstruction. It was supposed to be a functional space, neutral, fair, clean, and it was all of those things. And none of that made it feel less like what it was, which was a room designed for one person to hurt another person as definitively as possible. By the 8-station hour, it was full. Species that Mara had only seen in briefing files were sitting in the upper tiers. A cluster of tall blue-gray Kareth in the far section, the Velkai delegation in a group together near the center row, Drath officials filling an entire tier on the left side, quiet and certain, the way people are quiet and certain when they already know their role, know the outcome of something, and are only present to watch it confirmed. Ambassador Cole sat in the human section with the other soldiers, and held her hands in her lap, very still. Suri sat alone, at the end of a row, with his journal open on his knee, and his pen ready. Vekara entered first, from the far side of the arena, and the draft section made a low collective sound. Not cheering exactly, more like acknowledgement, the way a crowd sounds when something they already respected confirms itself. She wore no extra armor, just her standard warlord-cased plating, and she moved onto the floor with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who has stood in arenas before and is not impressed by them. She was enormous, in a way that photographs and briefing files had not fully communicated. Her upper arms swung at her sides with the loose ease of things that weighed more than most humans and moved faster than most humans could track. Shoulders and upper chest caught the white arena light and made her look like something that had been built rather than born. Mara entered from the near side. She wore her standard duty uniform, no armor beyond the light protective vest she always wore on duty, nothing added for the occasion. She walked out onto the floor at a normal pace, neither fast nor slow, and stopped at the designated starting position. And several things happened in the crowd at once. The Velkai clicked. Some of the Karath stood up slightly. The Drath section laughed, not cruelly, simply with the comfortable ease of people watching something go the way they expected it to go. Mara looked across the floor at Vekara. Vekara looked back at her. The compact dual arbiter, a tall, thin species with 6 fingers on each hand, stepped to the edge of the floor, called the formal start, and stepped back. Seconds. Mara had read about Drath's speed and it trained against every simulation the human military had built for it, and none of that fully prepared her for the reality of it. Vekara moved like something that did not have to negotiate with inertia. All four arms coming into position with a practiced precision that had been built over 40 years of doing exactly this. And the first strike came from the upper right arm, a sweeping blow aimed at Mara's shoulder with enough force to crack the plating on most armored species. Mara did not block it. Blocking a Drath warlord cast strike with a human body was a structural disagreement that the human body would lose, and she knew it. She moved left instead, not enough to fully avoid it, enough to take it on the shoulder blade instead of the joint, and the impact hit like a door slamming into her from the side and sent her 3 steps sideways. The crowd made a sound. Mara stopped her feet, settled her weight, and stepped back. In. Vekara's expression shifted, just slightly, just a fraction, the adjustment of someone who hit a target and expected it to fall, and found that it had not. She came forward again, faster this time, the lower 2 arms moving in a crossing pattern designed to catch a retreating opponent, and Mara went low instead of back, under the crossing arc, and came up inside Vekara's reach and drove her elbow hard into the joint where the lower left arm connected to the body. It was the one weak point in Drath plating, the gap between plates that allowed arm movement, and Mara had spent 6 weeks locating it in simulations. Vekara made a sound that the translator did not catch, and stepped back. The Drath section went quiet. Suri's pen moved very fast. The next 3 minutes were not beautiful. They were not the kind of fight that looked good in records, or got described in poetry. They were 2 creatures with very different bodies, trying to use those bodies to end the fight, and they were both good at it, and it showed. Vekara landed 2 more solid strikes, one across Mara's ribs that made something creak that should not creak, one that caught her forearm when she raised it, and left the arm briefly numb from wrist to elbow. And each time, the crowd leaned forward expecting the human to go down and stay down. Each time, Mara got back up, not with a shout, not with a dramatic moment, just got back up and returned to her feet, and came forward again. And this was the thing that Vekara had not prepared for. Not the human's technique, which was good but not extraordinary. Not her strength, which was adequate but not remarkable. The thing that Vekara had not prepared for was the continuing. Every species that Vekara had ever fought followed the same deep biological pattern. Damage accumulated, pain built, the body's self-preservation system grew louder and louder until it overrode the conscious mind, and the fighter began to retreat, to protect, to choose survival over victory. It was not weakness. It was simply how living things worked. It was the reason combat was finite. The human did not do this. The human took damage and became more concentrated, not less. Her movements got smaller and more precise as the fight went on. Less energy spent on anything that was not directly necessary, like a machine that was shedding everything that was not essential. And her eyes, which had been calm at the start, were calm now in a different way, a colder way, the way a very still and very deep body of water is calm. Vekara drove forward with a full 4-arm combination that she had never seen fail at this stage of a fight. Mara took 1 hit on the left side, absorbed it, and turned inside the motion. And when Vekara's momentum carried her slightly past center, Mara used that momentum and her own weight and the geometry of the moment and put the Drath warrior onto the floor. The arena was silent. Vekara was face down on the gray composite, Mara's weight across her back, Mara's arm locked around the joint of the upper right arm at an angle that the Drath warrior's body could not override. One direction, and it would hold. The other direction, and the joint would give. And Vekara, who had 40 years of combat experience, knew this instantly, and went still. The arbiter moved to the edge of the floor. The crowd did not breathe. Mara held the position for 3 seconds, long enough to make it certain, long enough for every sensor in the arena to record the outcome clearly, and then she released the arm, stood up, and stepped back. She did not raise her hands. She did not say anything. She just stood there, breathing harder than before, her left side doing something uncomfortable, and looked at Vakara on the floor in front of her with the same expression she had worn at the reception when she picked up the Duel token. Not triumphant, not angry, just settled, like a question that had been asked and answered. Vakara lay still for a moment. Then she pushed herself up slowly, onto her knees, and then onto her feet, and she turned and looked at Mara. And for the first time in her 40-year career as a Drath Warlord caste warrior, something moved through her chest that she did not have a word for. It was not fear of dying. She had faced that before and knew its shape. This was different, quieter, more unsettling. It was the feeling of someone who has spent a lifetime being absolutely certain of something and has just, very suddenly, become uncertain. The Arbiter announced the result. The Drath section made no sound at all. For a moment after the Arbiter spoke, nobody in the arena moved. Not the Drath section, not the Velkai, not the Karath standing in their tier. The entire room was locked in the particular stillness of a crowd that has just seen something that does not fit inside any of the categories it had prepared for the event. The Arbiter had been officiating compact duels for 30 years and had announced results in every tone the job required. Solemn, formal, quick, drawn out. And right now he was announcing this one in the same flat official voice he used for everything. Because that was his job. And yet, even his voice sounded slightly uncertain around the edges. As if the words were correct, but the situation they described was not something the language had been designed to handle. Vakara had lost. That was the fact. It sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water. You could see the ripples moving outward from it in every direction. The edges of the crowd and comeback changed. Mara stood on the arena floor and breathed and waited for the room to catch up. Her left side hurt in a way that suggested at least 2 ribs had opinions about the last 15 minutes, and her forearm had moved from numb back to painful, which she understood was the correct direction for recovery, even if it did not feel like it. She did not let any of this show on her face, not because she was performing for the crowd, but because her face did not generally show things she had not decided to show. She watched Vakara. The Drath warrior was on her feet, which Mara had not entirely assumed would be the case. Drath were physically resilient, and the move that had ended the fight was a control hold, not a strike. So there was no significant injury, just the very clear mechanical fact of a position that could not continue. Vakara had understood the geometry immediately, and stopped, which told Mara something about the way things should go. Warrior's intelligence that she had already suspected. Vakara was looking at her, not with anger. Mara had expected anger and was prepared for it, with something that was harder to read and in some ways harder to deal with. A look of concentrated assessment, like someone taking apart a machine to find out why it did something they had not predicted. The Arbiter completed the announcement. The duel was decided. Under compact law, that meant it was over. Fully, officially, legally over, all claims held, all political terms of the challenge fulfilled. And in the history of Drath formal dueling, what came next was one of 2 things. The victor either declared the defeated's life forfeit, which was accepted custom, or declared a binding submission, which meant the defeated owed service or resource or political alignment to the victor. Mara turned and walked toward the edge of the floor. The crowd made a noise, not a cheer, not a gasp. Between, a sound that had no clean name because it had not been needed before. A confused collective exhale, the sound of a room full of people all asking the same question at the same time without speaking it. She had not declared either. She had not declared anything. She had simply stopped and walked away. And in 40 centuries of Drath dueling tradition, this had not happened. Not because it was forbidden. Nothing in the law said a victor had to make a declaration, only that the right existed, but because no victor had ever seen a reason to walk away from both options. because walking away from both options meant you did not want the defeated's death and did not want their submission, which meant you had fought purely to answer a question, and having answered it, were finished. The Velkai scholar Suri had stopped writing. He was sitting with his pen touching the page of his journal, and not moving, and his skin had gone from silver back to gray, meant his anxiety had passed, but his eyes were very wide and very focused on the floor, where Mara had been standing. Ambassador Cole was on her feet in the human section. She had stood up at some point during the final 30 seconds of the fight, without noticing she had done it. And now, she sat back down slowly, and put her hand over her mouth, and breathed. Corporal Thresh leaned back in his seat, and crossed his arms and nodded once, the private satisfied nod of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. In the draft section, Ambassador Thel Oris was very still and very quiet, and his expression was the expression of a person doing complex political mathematics very quickly. Mara reached the corridor outside the arena, accepted a medical kit from the station medic stationed there, and pressed a cold compress to her ribs. The station doctor, a Velkai with quick, careful hands, asked if she wanted to go to the medical bay. In a bit, Mara said, stood in the corridor and waited. And she had been there for about 12 minutes when she heard the heavy, even footsteps of Drath armor behind her. She turned. Vekara stood in the corridor entrance. She had not sent an attendant, had not announced herself, had not asked through the arbiter for a formal meeting. She had just walked out of the arena and come to where Mara was standing, which Mara thought said something worth knowing about what kind of person she was when the ceremony was stripped away. For a moment they stood in the corridor and looked at each other, and neither of them spoke. And it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had recently learned something significant about each other, and were taking a moment before words. You left, Vekara said. Yes, Mara said. You had the right to claim my life, Vekara said, or my service. It was yours under compact law. You walked away from both. Vekara was quiet for a moment. She was looking at Mara with that same taking apart expression, and Mara let her look. Why? Vekara said. Mara considered the question seriously, the same way she had considered Suri's question about fear. She did not dismiss it or give it a quick answer. She actually thought about it, standing in the corridor with a compress against her ribs. You weren't a threat anymore, she said, and I didn't need you dead. Those were the only two reasons I had to keep going, and when the first one was gone, and the second one was never there was nothing left to do. Vekara's forearms were loose at her sides, not the careful loose of someone controlling their posture, genuinely loose, which, on a Drath warrior in the aftermath of a lost duel, was a significant physical statement. In 4,000 years of Drath dueling, Vekara said slowly, no victor has walked away without a claim. That's a long time. Mara said, and maybe the option just never came up the right way before. What does that mean? It means you'd have to not want anything from the person you beat, Mara said. And you'd have to be finished when you were finished, instead of continuing, because continuing is what's expected. We're pretty good at stopping when we're done, humans. We don't always need the extra step. Vekara looked at her for a long time. Then she said very quietly, the way someone says something they have not said before, and are not certain how it will sound out loud. I have never fought anything like you. Mara nodded. I know, she said, not unkindly. Most people haven't. She picked up the coffee she had set on the medic's cart when she arrived. It was lukewarm, which was approximately the temperature she expected all her coffee to be, because that was how her life worked. And she took a sip. Vekara watched her do this, with an expression that, on a Drath warrior, was the closest available equivalent to the human expression of someone whose entire understanding of the subject has just been quietly rearranged. Your species is very strange, Vekara said. Yes, Mara said. "We are." She paused. "You'll get used to it," she said. And she walked toward the medical bay. And Vakara stood in the corridor, alone, and thought about things she had not thought about before. And the station moved quietly through space around her. And far away, in the draft section, Fel Oris was sending a very difficult message home. The message boards on Conclave Oru had never moved faster. Within an hour of the duel's end, the official record had been accessed 40,000 times across the station's network. By the next morning, request copies were being transmitted to 17 different home systems, 3 compact academic institutions, and at least 1 military analysis department that had not officially admitted to watching the fight. The betting terminals had paid out to the small number of people who had put credit on the human and then immediately closed, because the odds model the terminal used had no framework for recalibrating after an event it had assigned a 0.29% probability to. Ambassador Fel Oris had sent his difficult message home, and was now sitting in his quarters, not eating the meal his attendant had brought him, and not answering his communication requests, which were numerous. The diplomatic sessions resumed the next morning. They were different. Dramatically different. The same table, the same room, the same amber lighting, the same careful formal language, but the weight in the room had shifted in a way that everyone could feel and nobody acknowledged directly, which was how diplomatic things usually worked. The 3 mineral-rich systems near human space were no longer the site of a drawn-out argument. Within 4 hours of the session opening, 2 of the previously resistant delegations had moved to positions much closer to Earth's terms, and by midday the framework of an agreement was on the table that Ambassador Cole had not expected to see for another 3 weeks. Cole sat across from Mara that evening and told her this, and Mara nodded and ate her dinner. "You understand what you did in that arena," Cole said. "Not just winning, the way you ended it. That is what changed the room." "I just stopped when I was done," Mara said. "You stopped in a way that no one in that room had ever seen." Cole said, "And they did not know what to do with it. And when people do not know what to do with something, they become careful. And when they become careful, they become willing to negotiate." Mara thought about this. "That seems like a lot of weight to put on one fight," she said. "That is how the compact works," Cole said simply. Across the station, in a research room he had been occupying for 36 hours straight, Suri had filled his entire journal and had moved to a second one. He had been transmitting summary notes to his university on his homeworld throughout, and the responses had gone from polite interest to active urgency. His department head had replied to the last one with 3 questions and a request for a full preliminary report as soon as possible. Suri was not ready to write the full report yet, because he did not think he fully understood what he had seen yet, and he was a careful scholar who did not write things down as conclusions until he was certain of them, but he was getting closer. He had spent the night pulling every available human historical record from the Compact's combined archives and reading them in sequence, which was not something he had done before. Most species researchers sampled historical records rather than reading them in order, because history was long and careers were finite. But he had a specific question now, and he wanted to see if the answer was consistent across the full length of the record, or only recent. The answer was consistent. Human history, read from beginning to present, was a documentation of a species that should not have survived as many things as it had survived. Plagues that killed 1/3 of the population and were followed, within a generation, by population growth. Wars that destroyed entire civilizations and were followed, within decades, by reconstruction. Environmental collapses, resource failures, internal conflicts on a scale that would have permanently fragmented most species. And after every single one of these events, the humans had continued, had rebuilt, had moved forward, and had frequently within a surprisingly short time decided to try the thing that had nearly destroyed them again. Not because they were stupid, the record showed clearly they were not, but because they seemed to have a relationship with damage that was different from every other species Suri had studied. Other species survived catastrophe by learning to avoid it. Humans survived catastrophe by learning to absorb it. Suri sat with this distinction for a long time. Then he opened a new message to his university and wrote one line in the summary field before composing the full body of the note. We have been framing humanity as a young species. I do not think this is the correct frame. I think humanity is simply patient. He sent it and went back to his journal. On the other side of the station, in a formal office used by compact observers, a document was being processed that no one had expected to see. It was a petition from Vekara, Warlord Caste, Third Bloodline, Drathreach, a formal request to be assigned as a compact observer attached to Earth's diplomatic delegation. The petition listed her qualifications, which were extensive, and her reasons, which were not. The reason field contained one word: education. The processing officer read the petition twice, checked the relevant regulations, found nothing that technical prohibited it, and forwarded it to the appropriate committee, with a note that said the committee should probably discuss it in person because he was not sure what to do with it. The committee, which met that afternoon, discussed it for 2 hours, and ultimately approved it, partly because the regulations were clear, and partly because nobody wanted to be the person who formally denied a Drath Warlord Caste veteran anything. On the same day, the records of her duel were being reviewed by 17 different political and academic institutions. Vekara received the confirmation in her quarters, and read it once, and put it down, and sat for a while, looking at nothing. She was trying to do something she had not done much before, which was think about something she did not already know. She was very good at thinking about things she knew, at applying her knowledge to new situations. But this was different. This was recognizing a gap in the knowledge itself, a place where the map she had been using had drawn the wrong terrain. She had fought for 40 years, and she had been very good at it, and she had always understood, at the level where things are understood without being stated, that she was at or near the top of what a living thing could achieve in close combat. By being better. Vekara was honest with herself. She always had been. It was a quality she valued. The human had beaten her by being different, by operating from a set of parameters that Vekara's 40 years of experience had not included, by treating pain and damage as information rather than as commands. Vekara had been trained to win. The human had been trained to continue. They were not the same thing, and the difference was not small. She thought about this for a long time. In the station's human section, the evening had settled into the ordinary rhythm of people at the end of a long day. The soldiers were eating and talking. The ambassador was going through paperwork. The day was finishing the way days finished. Mara was in the observation corridor, sitting on the bench that faced the wide windows, with a cup of coffee that was already going lukewarm in her hand. The stars outside were very still, which she knew was an illusion. Everything out there was moving at tremendous speed in tremendous directions. But from here, from this bench, in this moment, they looked still, and it was a good thing to look at. Corporal Thresh came and sat beside her after a while. They were quiet for a bit. Then Thresh said, "Did you actually feel in danger in there?" Mara looked at the stars. "The whole time," she said. Thresh nodded. He had expected that answer, or something close to it. "Then how do you do it?" he said. "How do you keep going when everything in you is saying stop?" Mara was quiet for a moment. "Being scared and stopping are two different things," she said. "They feel the same from the outside sometimes. They feel the same from the inside sometimes too. But they're not the same thing, and knowing the difference is the whole job." She took a sip of her coffee. "Humans figured that out a long time ago," she said. "We had a lot of practice." Stars drifted past the window, very slowly, which was another illusion. It was the station moving, not the stars. But it was a good illusion, the kind that made the universe feel navigable, rather than overwhelming, which was sometimes what you needed. Mara finished her coffee. She set the cup down on the bench beside her, Outside, the stars kept burning, billions of them, old and young and dying and just beginning, and the small metal station moved quietly through the space between them, carrying inside it a galaxy that was in the slow, uncertain process of revising everything it thought it knew about the strange, soft-skinned, painful-looking, absolutely impossible-to-stop species from a small blue world called Earth.